March 6, 1945, Cologne, Germany. The ancient city is a landscape of ghosts, 90% of it pulverized into a gray, snow-dusted desert by 4 years of Allied bombing. American troops of the 3rd Armored Division pick their way through the rubble, past the skeletal remains of the great cathedral. They are victorious. They have fought their way from the Normandy beaches, bled in the hedgerows, frozen in the Ardennes, and shattered the Siegfried Line. Now, they stand on the west bank of the Rhine River, and they stop. Every GI, from the highest general to the lowest private, stares east across the 500 yards of fast, dark water, and they all feel the same cold dread. The war is not over. The hardest fight is yet to come. Before them, the last of Cologne's great bridges, the Hohenzollern, is a tangled wreck of steel, its center span dropped into the river by retreating German engineers. It's the same story up and down the river. At Düsseldorf, the bridges are gone. At Bonn, gone. At Koblenz, gone. The Wehrmacht, in its final spiteful retreat, is executing Hitler's scorched earth decree with terrifying efficiency. The Rhine, Germany's sacred mythic barrier, is being sealed. It is a 400-mile-long water-filled fortress, the last great natural obstacle between the Allies and Berlin, and every single door is being blown shut. For the Allied High Command, this is the final, impossible problem. The strategic bombing campaign has crippled Germany's industry. The Battle of the Bulge has broken the back of its offensive capability. But the German army is not defeated. It has pulled its best remaining units, what's left of the 116th Panzer, the 11th Panzer, and thousands of elite battle-hardened paratroopers, back across the river. They are digging in on the east bank, pre-sighting artillery on every likely crossing point and waiting. They are preparing a killbox on a monstrous scale. The German plan is simple. Lure the Allies into a massive, predictable river assault, and then, while the infantry is helpless in their small boats, slaughter them. In his headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower convenes his top commanders. The question is simple and terrifying. How do we get across? The answer they keep coming back to is just as simple and just as terrifying. With brute force. The expert solution is handed to the meticulous, cautious, and brilliant British Field Marshal, Bernard Montgomery. It is codenamed Operation Plunder. It is to be the single largest, most overwhelming amphibious assault of the war in Europe, dwarfing even the D-Day landings in its raw concentration of firepower. The plan is a masterpiece of industrial warfare. First, a 3-week non-stop logistical buildup. 1 million tons of supplies, 300,000 men, thousands of amphibious vehicles, and mountains of ammunition must be brought to the river's edge, all in total secrecy. Then, the assault. On the night of March 23, 1945, 10,000 Allied aircraft will pound the East Bank, a rolling thunder of explosives designed to shatter the German defenders. Simultaneously, 5,000 artillery pieces, the largest single bombardment of the Western Front, will open fire, a continuous deafening roar that will last for hours, firing over 1 million shells. Then, and only then, would the first waves of infantry, men from the 9th U.S. Army and the British 2nd Army, hit the water. They would be paddling small canvas and wood assault boats, or riding in amphibious buffalo vehicles, paddling directly into a storm of pre-sighted machine gun fire and artillery. The expert consensus is unanimous. It will work. It is too big to fail, but the cost will be catastrophic. Allied planners, in their quiet, grim calculations, estimate casualties in the first wave alone could be as high as 60 to 80%. The Rhine, they all agree, will be a river of blood. The GIs on the ground know it. They are shown models of the crossing sites. They train in their small boats on the rivers of France, and they whisper. They know that this final push will be, for many of them, the last thing they ever do. But this is the only solution, because the Germans are not just defending, they are fighting for time. Time to produce their new terrifying wonder weapons. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, which is already shredding Allied bomber formations, and the V-2 rocket. Every day spent preparing for Operation Plunder is another day the war continues. Another day those factories can churn out weapons. Another day the concentration camps can continue their grim work. The clock is ticking. The Allies are staring at an unwinnable tactical problem. They have no answer, period. To win the war, they must cross the Rhine. And to cross the Rhine, they must pay a butcher's bill in blood. Tens of thousands of lives sacrificed on the East Bank. This is the expert consensus. This is the unmovable, strategic fact that has been accepted by Eisenhower, by Montgomery, by every general, analyst, and logistician. Unless a miracle happens. Unless somewhere on that 400-mile front the impossible occurs. Unless somewhere a bridge is missed. But the Germans are not fools. They are the most thorough, disciplined engineers in the world. The idea that they would simply forget a bridge or fail to destroy it is a fantasy. It's a fool's errand. Enter the 9th Armored Division. They call themselves the Phantom Division. Not because they are elite, shadowy special forces, but because they are brand new, untested, and frankly, a bit of an afterthought in the grand strategy of the European theater. They are a ghost division because no one really knows who they are. They'd only landed in France in October 1944 and had spent most of their time in the quiet sector of the Ardennes, a place for green troops to get their footing. Then in December, the quiet sector had exploded. The 9th Armored was one of the first units hit by the Battle of the Bulge. They had been badly mauled, taking heavy casualties, but they had held their ground. They had learned to fight not from training manuals, but from sheer desperate survival. Now, in early March 1945, the 9th Armored is assigned to General Courtney Hoge's U.S. First Army. They are part of Operation Lumberjack, a massive mop-up operation to clear all German resistance from the west bank of the Rhine. Their orders are simple, and they have absolutely nothing to do with crossing the river. Their orders are to push east until they reach the river, link up with other units, and then turn south. They are to wheel away from the Rhine and act as a flank guard for General George Patton's Third Army, which is fighting further south. They are a cleanup crew, an exploitation force. They are not the tip of the spear. But the commander of the 9th's Combat Command B is a man named Brigadier General William M. Hoge. Hoge is 51 years old. He is not a dashing, pearl-handled pistol cavalryman like Patton. He is an engineer. He had built roads in the Philippines, served in World War I, and spent his entire career solving practical physical problems. He is pragmatic, quiet, and known for being thorough. A man who reads maps with an engineer's eye. And he has been given his orders: clear the area, then turn south. But as his division moves, something strange happens. The German resistance, which was supposed to be fierce, isn't just crumbling, it's evaporating. The 9th Armored, this green division, is moving at a breakneck pace. They are capturing entire towns with barely a shot fired. The Wehrmacht is in a full disorganized rout, a mad dash to get back across the Rhine. Hoge, staring at his maps, sees his men gobbling up miles. He sees his objective turn south. But he also sees the Rhine, just a few miles further east, and he sees a tiny town on its banks, a town called Remagen. On his map, a thin black line crosses the river at that town. A railroad bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge. His orders are clear. This bridge is not his objective. It's almost certainly gone, just like all the others. His superiors, namely his Corps Commander General Milliken, have explicitly told him to turn south, to not get entangled at the river. But Hoge is an engineer, and to an engineer, a bridge is a thing to be captured, not bypassed. He has a hunch, a nagging, persistent, illogical hunch. What if the Germans in their panic were late? What if the bridge was still there? On the morning of March 7, 1945, General Hoge makes a decision. It is a decision that could, and perhaps should, have gotten him court-martialed for disobeying a direct order. He doesn't call his superiors. He doesn't ask for permission. He calls the commander of his lead task force, the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann. He gives him a new unauthorized command. Don't turn south, Hoge says. Forget the flank. Race to the Rhine. Get to Remagen as fast as you can. See what's there. If you find a bridge and it's still standing, take it. The tip of the spear of Hoge's unauthorized spear is A Company, 27th Armored Infantry, part of a task force led by Lieutenant Colonel Engemann. And the man at the very, very front of this fool's errand, in the lead M3 half-track, is a 26-year-old second lieutenant named Karl H. Timmerman. Timmerman is exhausted. He's been in constant combat for weeks, running on stale coffee and adrenaline. He was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and his family had emigrated to the U.S. when he was a child. Now he is back, leading an American platoon into his former homeland. His new orders are simple: see what's at Remagen. Nobody, not General Hoge, not Colonel Engemann, and certainly not Lieutenant Timmerman, actually expects to find anything. This is a reconnaissance mission, a long shot, a way to tick a box before turning south. They are driving into a fog, expecting to find nothing but rubble and another blown bridge, another dead end. They are about to become the most important platoon in the world. They are about to drive straight into a one-in-a-million miracle. March 7, 1945. 1 p.m. the lead elements of Lieutenant Karl Timmerman's platoon, a company, 27th Armored Infantry, reached the high wooded slopes of the Victoriaberg, a hill overlooking the small, sleepy town of Remagen. The GIs are tired, their boots caked in mud. They are running on fumes and the dregs of last night's coffee. This is just another town on the map, another objective to be cleared before the real agonizing work of turning south. The air is cold, gray, and damp with a persistent drizzle. They expect to find a few die-hard snipers, a booby-trapped roadblock, and like everywhere else, the shattered, smoking ruins of a bridge. Lieutenant Timmerman, flanked by his NCOs, advances on foot with the lead recon patrol. They move through the trees, weapons ready. Below them, the town of Remagen sits quietly in the river valley. And then they see it. Timmerman's platoon sergeant, Alex Drabik, a tough barrel-chested NCO, raises his binoculars to his eyes. He scans the town, the river, and freezes. His arms drop slowly. He turns to Timmerman, his face a mask of disbelief. He wipes his eyes on his sleeve as if to clear them of a mirage, and looks again. "My God, Lieutenant," he says, his voice barely a whisper. "You'd better look at this." Timmerman raises his own field glasses. His heart stops. He can't breathe. There, spanning the Rhine, dark, massive, and silhouetted against the gray sky, is the Ludendorff Bridge. It's not just damaged. It's not partially collapsed. It is fully, completely, and impossibly intact. A web of black steel stretching 400 yards from the town of Remagen, on the west bank, to the village of Erpel on the east. On the far side, in the town of Erpel, a high cliff face looms, honeycombed with tunnels and, they can now see, German machine gun nests. But the bridge itself, it's standing. It's a railroad bridge, a double-track line built in World War I by Russian prisoners of war. Its two massive, medieval-looking stone towers on either end make it look more like a fortress than a piece of infrastructure. And it is, without a doubt, the last bridge standing on the Rhine. The radio message crackles to life, a frantic staccato burst that would change the course of the war. Timmerman gets on the horn to his task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Engemann, who is just behind him with the main body of tanks and infantry. "Bridge is standing," Timmerman reports, his voice tight. "I can see it. It's intact." Engemann, a hardened combat veteran, is floored. He demands confirmation. "Are you sure? Is it usable?" "Affirmative," Timmerman radios back. "It's standing, but the far side is heavily defended, and they've seen us." As if on cue, a German 20mm flak gun, positioned on the Erpel cliffs, opens up. The thump, thump, thump of its shells echoes across the valley as green tracers zip over the Americans' heads. The message is relayed instantly, up the chain, from Engemann's half-track to Combat Command B headquarters. General William M. Hoge, the 51-year-old engineer who had sent his men on this fool's errand, gets the call. "We've got a bridge, General. It's standing." At Remagen. For a moment, Hoge is silent. His hunch, his unauthorized gamble that had violated his direct orders, had just hit the strategic jackpot of the entire war. The Phantom 9th Armored Division had just found the impossible, but now, the test begins. Hoge races forward in his command jeep, bouncing over the shattered roads to see for himself. As he travels, Engemann's task force, now a mix of the 27th Armored Infantry, the 14th Tank Battalion, and the 656th Tank Destroyer Battalion, begins its push into the town of Remagen. This is no longer a recon mission. It is a full-scale assault. The town, however, is not undefended. German machine guns and snipers, a rearguard left to protect the bridge's demolition, open up from windows and rooftops. For 2 hours, a company fights a bitter close-quarters battle, clearing the town street by street, building by building. Now we must shift our view. Across the river, in the German command post on the east bank, there is not order. There is not an elite SS defense. There is only blind bureaucratic panic. The man in command of the bridge is Captain Wilhelm Bratke. He is a combat engineer, a veteran, but he is exhausted, and he is a man being crushed by the system. For days, Bratke has been watching the American columns get closer. For days, he has been frantically radioing his superiors, begging for permission to destroy the bridge. And for days, he has been told to wait. The German High Command, desperate to get its own retreating units back across, has forbidden him from blowing it until the very last second. Worse, Bratke is working with faulty tools. The expert German demolition plan for the Ludendorff Bridge was a masterpiece. It called for 200 pounds of high-grade military dynamite explosives to be packed into specially designed demolition chambers built into the bridge's piers. Those explosives could have vaporized the bridge, but in the chaos of the retreat, those 200 pounds of dynamite had been ordered removed weeks earlier and sent to another sector. The engineer in charge of the explosives, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, had been sent 600 pounds of industrial Westphalet as a replacement. It was, essentially, weak mining dynamite, never intended to shear the hardened steel of a bridge. Friesenhahn, a competent engineer, knew this was not enough. He did his best, packing the 600 pounds onto the bridge's main girders, but he knew it might not work. His real problem, however, was the trigger. The main detonation system was electrical, run by a long cable from his command post to the charges. But the cable was old, and the American artillery that had been pounding the area for days had been cutting it repeatedly. Friesenhahn and his men had been forced to crawl out onto the bridge multiple times to splice the wires back together. They were terrified the system would fail. Back on the West Bank, at 3:15 p.m., the first American tank, a brand new 46th M26 Pershing, one of the first to see combat in Europe, clanks into the Remagen town square, its 90mm gun swiveling toward the bridge. Captain Bragge, the German commander, sees it. This is the last second he has been waiting for. He picks up his field phone and gives the order to his engineer, Friesenhahn. Blow it! Springen! Now! Captain Friesenhahn, in his dugout on the east bank, slams his hand down on the electrical detonation plunger. He turns the key. He pushes the plunger again. Nothing. A cold, sick feeling floods his stomach. The electrical system is dead. The American artillery, or perhaps the concussion from the tank shells, must have severed the line. The primary trigger, the expert solution, has failed. The ambush is off. Panicked, Friesenhahn screams to his NCO. The backup! Light the backup fuse! Now go! This is the manual override, the last-ditch attempt. It is a simple, old-fashioned, waterproof fuse that runs from the command post out to the main charges. It has a 10-minute burn time. A young German sergeant grabs a lighter, scrambles from the dugout, and runs onto the bridge's railway tracks. He finds the fuse, ignites it, and watches as it sputters to life, burning down, a slow, sizzling snake of fire crawling toward 600 pounds of dynamite. Back on the West Bank, Lieutenant Timmerman's men have finished clearing the town. They are huddling behind the stone abutments of the bridge's western tower. They too have heard the German command, the shouts of Sprengen, carried across the water. They are staring at a 400-yard gauntlet of open steel. They know the bridge is mined. They know that at any second, it is going to disappear in a fireball. The lead Pershing tank fires a shell at the eastern towers, trying to suppress the machine guns. It is at this exact moment, around 3:45 p.m., that General Hoge's jeep skids to a halt on the hill above. He stares at the intact bridge. He sees his men, tiny figures clustered at the western end. He sees the puffs of smoke from the German machine guns on the far side. He knows his orders are to turn south. He knows this bridge is a death trap. He knows his men are infantry, not engineers, and they are not equipped for this. This is the boardroom conflict, and it's happening in his head, in a span of 30 seconds. The by-the-book solution is to pull back and let the artillery handle it. But Hoge is an engineer. He sees the impossible chance. He grabs the radio handset from his aide. He gets Colonel Engelmann on the line. I want that bridge, Hoge says, his voice flat and hard, cutting through the static. Get your men across. Get all your men across, now. The order was given. I want that bridge. Get your men across, now. That command, spoken by General William M. Hoge into a radio handset on a muddy hillside, was perhaps the single most consequential and dangerous order of the European campaign. It was an act of supreme instinctive and unauthorized audacity. Hoge, an engineer, was staring at a 400-yard railroad bridge, a structure he knew with 100% certainty was packed with explosives. He was looking at two massive stone towers on the far bank that were spitting machine gun fire. He was, in effect, ordering an infantry battalion to charge into a pre-planned ambush, a kill box designed to annihilate them. And he was doing it in direct violation of his standing orders from his superior, 3 Corps Commander General John Milliken, who had explicitly directed the 9th Armored to turn south, to avoid this very entanglement. If Hoge was wrong, if the bridge was a trap and the Germans successfully detonated it with A Company halfway across, he would be responsible for the massacre of an entire American battalion. His career would be over, and he would be remembered as a reckless fool who sacrificed his men for nothing. This was the boardroom conflict, and it was happening inside one man's skull. It was a battle between the by-the-book logic of the entire Allied war plan and the gut-level hunch of a single engineer. The expert consensus of Operation Plunder, with its 5,000-gun bombardments, was the safe, bureaucratic, and bloody answer. This was a gamble of insane proportions. But Hoge had seen the frantic, disorganized movements on the far bank. He had bet on chaos over German efficiency. He had made his decision. The order stood. The command filtered down. From Hoge to Colonel Engemann, and from Engemann to the man on the ground, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann. Timmermann was huddled with his platoon behind the stone abutments of the Western Tower. He was 26 years old. He had been born in Frankfurt, and he had just been ordered to lead his men onto that bridge. He looked at his platoon. The men of A Company, 27th Armored Infantry. They were kids, most of them. They'd been fighting for weeks, they were exhausted, and they were terrified. They, too, had heard the German shouts of Sprengen. They had seen the puffs of smoke from the MG-42s. They were infantrymen, not bomb disposal experts. To them, the bridge was not a strategic prize. It was 400 yards of certain death. This was Timmermann's personal boardroom conflict. How do you order men to do this? How do you ask them to sprint into a wall of lead, onto a platform you know is designed to explode? He looked at his platoon sergeant, Alex Drabik. He looked at Sergeant Mike Deligio and Sergeant Joseph Deligio, two brothers in the same platoon. He knew every one of them, and he knew what he was about to ask. There was no time for a speech. There was no time for patriotic platitudes. There was only the order. But as Timmermann was about to blow his whistle, the Germans' own ticking clock was running out. Across the river, in the engineer's dugout at the base of the Erpel cliff, the 10-minute manual fuse was burning. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer, was staring at it, praying. He had failed with the electrical plunger. This was his last chance. The fuse was his expert solution, his backup. Captain Bratch, the bridge commander, was in his command post in the tunnels above, frantically on the phone to his own superiors at headquarters. He was screaming for reinforcements, for artillery support, for anything. "The Americans are in Remagen," he yelled. "They are at the bridge. I must destroy it. I need help." The answer he received was the cold, bureaucratic hand of a dying regime. "You must hold at all costs," the voice on the other end replied. "The 11th Panzer Division is being rerouted. Hold." Braga slammed the phone down. Hold with what? A handful of engineers, some panicked Volkssturm old men, and a few machine gunners? He had been abandoned. The system had failed him. His superiors, safe in their rear area bunkers, had just condemned him. Down by the river, the 10-minute fuse sputtered to its end. At approximately 3:50 p.m., it reached the 600 pounds of weak industrial Westphalit dynamite. The world exploded. From the American perspective on the West Bank, it was the end. A colossal, deafening kaboom ripped the air. The entire 3,000-ton steel structure of the Ludendorff Bridge visibly jumped from its stone foundations. A massive column of black smoke, splintered wood, and twisted steel erupted from the center of the span, climbing hundreds of feet into the sky. The shockwave knocked GIs off their feet. The Pershing tank, parked in the town square, was peppered with debris. General Hoge, on the hillside, watched his one-in-a-million chance vaporize before his eyes. Colonel Engemann, his heart sinking, grabbed his radio. "Report! Report, what's the status?" The men of A Company, cowering behind the tower, were in stunned silence. The bridge was gone. The ambush was real. Their friends who might have been near it were dead. The air rained debris, then a strange sound. Not the splash of a collapsing bridge, but the groaning of tortured metal. Slowly, agonizingly, the thick black smoke began to clear. Timmermann looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. The bridge was still there. It was a mangled, twisted, smoking wreck. The explosion had blown a 30-foot hole in the wooden planking over the railroad ties. Girders were bent. The whole structure was visibly sagging. But the main supports, the primary steel structure, had held. The Germans' expert plan had failed. The 600 pounds of industrial dynamite, just as Captain Friesenhahn had feared, was not strong enough to cut the hardened steel of a World War I-era railroad bridge. The Germans had sprung their trap, and the trap had failed. They had fired their biggest bullet, and the target was still standing. A wild animal cheer erupted from the GIs. The bridge was still there. They were still alive. The Germans on the far side were in even greater shock. They stared in horror at the intact bridge. They were now essentially defenseless. They had secondary, smaller nuisance charges, but their main weapon was spent. This was the moment. The boardroom conflict was over. The gamble had been tested. Hoge, on the hill, saw the bridge was still standing. Engelmann, closer to the front, saw it too. He grabbed his radio and roared at Timmerman. "The bridge is up. It's holding. Go, go, go. Get your men across. Get across now. Before they try again." Lieutenant Karl Timmerman stood up. He turned to his men. The air was still thick with acrid smoke. The German machine guns, realizing their error, were opening up again, a frantic, desperate spray of bullets. Timmerman drew his .45 pistol. He put his whistle to his lips. "Okay, men," he shouted over the din. "This is it. We're going. Follow me. Get your heads down and run like hell." It was 3:50 p.m. March 7th, 1945. The air over the Rhine was a toxic gray-black soup of dynamite smoke and pulverized debris. The Ludendorff Bridge, mangled and groaning but miraculously standing, was a 400-yard gauntlet of twisted steel, shattered wood, and certain death. On the far bank, the German machine gun crews in the stone towers, recovering from the shock of their own failed demolition, swung their MG-42s back toward the western end. They had failed to destroy the bridge. They would make it a killing field instead. On the west bank, huddled behind the stone abutment, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman looked at the men of A Company. They had just watched a 600-pound charge detonate. They were now being ordered to run into the smoke. Timmerman, the 26-year-old German-born lieutenant, stood up. He drew his .45 pistol and put his whistle to his lips. He gave 2 short, shrill blasts. "Okay, men, this is it," he yelled over the din. "We're going! Follow me! Get your heads down and run like hell. Go, go, go!" For a half-second, nobody moved. The sheer suicidal impossibility of the order was paralyzing. They were being told to charge on foot, across a bridge, into the teeth of machine guns, with tanks and artillery supporting them from behind. It was a backwards charge. It was a death run. Then one man bolted from the crowd. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a former butcher from Ohio, tucked his helmet down, gripped his M1 rifle, and just ran. He didn't fire. He didn't zigzag. He sprinted, head down like a bull, straight onto the clattering wooden planks of the bridge. His charge broke the spell. The rest of the first squad, Timmerman included, surged after him. "Covering fire! Covering fire!" came the screams. From the town square, the M26 Pershing tanks, seeing the charge, opened up with everything they had. Their 90mm cannons fired high explosive shells, a deafening crack boom, slamming into the stone towers on the far bank. Their .50 caliber machine guns hammered away, sending thousands of tracers arcing over the heads of the running men, desperately trying to suppress the German gunners. But the German MG-42s were in fortified, concrete and stone positions. They were protected, and they opened up. The sound was a terrifying, overwhelming roar. It was the heavy clang, clang, clang of the GI's boots on the railroad ties, the crack of the Pershing's main gun, and the brrrr of the German MG-42s. The rip of those machine guns, firing 200 rounds a minute, was like a giant sheet of canvas being torn in half. Bullets snapped past the men's heads, zinging off the high steel girders with sickening ricochets, and chewed the wooden planking at their feet, sending up clouds of splinters. Men screamed. One GI just yards onto the bridge crumpled, his leg shattered. Another was hit in the chest, spun around, and fell. The charge was already costing blood. But this was not just a charge. It was 2 charges in one. The first squad, led by Drabick and Timmerman, had one job: get across. Their objective was the far tower, the hill, the tunnels. They were the spearhead, tasked with silencing the guns. But behind them came the second wave, the second platoon, and they had an even more suicidal job. This was the group led by Lieutenant Emmett Burroughs, a 23-year-old engineering graduate from New York. His men weren't just running. They were carrying wire cutters, demolition kits, and carbines. Their mission was not to get across the bridge. Their mission was to save it. They had to assume the Germans had other charges, a secondary system, a backup to the backup. They were charging into an ambush, and their job was to disarm the ambush while it was trying to kill them. This was the charge that saved the platoon. While Drabick's men ran, Burroughs' men, including Sergeant Joseph Delisio and his brother, Sergeant Mike Delisio, ran in a crouch, their eyes darting not at the enemy, but at the bridge deck. They were hunting for wires. They fanned out, braving the machine gun fire, and began frantically searching the girders. Sergeant Joseph Delisio saw it first, a thick black rubber-coated cable running along the eastern side of the bridge. It was the main detonation cable for the charges that had failed, or perhaps for new charges. "Here!" he yelled. "Here it is!" He and his brother Mike didn't hesitate. As bullets snapped over their heads, They dropped to their knees, pulled out their standard-issue wire cutters and began hacking at the thick cable. It was like trying to cut a garden hose with nail clippers. An MG-42 on the cliff, seeing them, swiveled and opened up. A stream of bullets slammed into the steel girder just inches above their heads, showering them with sparks and paint chips. They didn't flinch. They just kept cutting, their knuckles bloody until the cable snapped in two. Further up, Lieutenant Burrows himself was doing the same. He was sprinting from girder to girder, his carbine in one hand, wire cutters in the other. He was an engineer, and he knew what to look for. He found another wire, cut it. He saw a wooden box, a suspected charge, and emptied his carbine into it. He was a man possessed, a one-man bomb disposal squad in the middle of a firefight. Then, Sergeant Delicio spotted a second charge. This one, a 500-pound box of explosives, was still connected. It was sitting on a main support beam, and a thin wisp of smoke was coming from it. The remnants of the manual fuse that had failed to properly detonate it. It was a dud. Or maybe it was just waiting. Joseph Delicio ran to it, pulled out his knife and cut the last connecting wires. He kicked it. It didn't budge. He yelled for his brother. The two men under fire in the middle of the bridge wrestled the 500-pound charge, heaving and shoving it until it tipped over the side and fell with a massive splash into the Rhine below. All of this was happening in seconds. At the front of the charge, Sergeant Alex Drabic, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, never stopped. He was the first American to set foot on the east bank of the Rhine. He didn't stop to celebrate. He didn't stop to set up a defense. He saw the nearest stone tower, the source of the machine gun fire, and charged it. His squad was right behind him. They reached the massive wooden door of the tower, kicked it in, and threw in 3 grenades. The explosions were muffled, followed by screams. Drabic and his men burst in, their submachine guns firing, clearing the tower in a vicious 10-second firefight. At the same time, Lieutenant Timmerman, who was just seconds behind Drabic, led his team up the high, rocky slope toward the Erpel railway tunnel, the main German command post. They were now deep in enemy territory, a single platoon against an unknown force. They reached the mouth of the tunnel and opened fire, forcing the Germans back into the darkness. On the bridge, Lieutenant Burrows and his men had done it. They had cut the primary cables. They had kicked the live charges into the river. They had disarmed the trap. The whole action, from Timmerman's whistle to Drabic securing the far tower, had taken less than 15 minutes. It was 4:05 p.m. A company, 27th Armored Infantry, was across the Rhine. The cost was surprisingly, miraculously light, but not zero. 11 men had been hit on the bridge. One would later die of his wounds. It was a miracle. But it was a miracle bought with the blood of those GIs. Karl Timmerman, his face black with smoke and dirt, stood on the east bank. He was the first American officer to cross the Rhine. He looked back at the smoking, mangled but beautiful bridge. It was still standing, and now, seeing the charge had succeeded, the rest of his battalion, hundreds of men, were streaming across it, a river of olive drab flowing east. They had done the impossible. They had charged the ambush, disarmed it while it was firing, and saved not just their platoon but the entire division. They had just shortened the war in Europe. The message that flashed from the east bank of the Rhine at 4:05 p.m., March 7, 1945, was simple. A company across. Bridge secure, Timmerman reporting. That signal, sent by a 26-year-old lieutenant, hit the Allied command structure like a lightning bolt, a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock. In General William Hoge's command post, there was a stunned silence, then an eruption of wild cheers. Hoge, the engineer who had gambled his career on a hunch, grabbed the radio. His next order was simple: stuff the bridgehead. Get everything you have across that bridge. Now, don't stop. The news flew up the chain of command, a wildfire of disbelief. It hit the 3 Corps headquarters of General John Milliken, the man who had explicitly ordered Hoge to turn south. Milliken was floored, his meticulous plans for a flank maneuver instantly rendered obsolete. The message reached General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army. Hodges, a quiet, reserved man, reportedly laughed out loud. He immediately called his boss, General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. When Bradley's aide took the call, he listened, hung up, and turned to his boss. "Sir," the aide said, "Hodges has just captured a bridge at Remagen, intact." Bradley, famously unflappable, looked at his aide and said, "A bridge? You sure you're not drunk?" When the message was confirmed, Bradley's mind raced. He, like every other high commander, was a prisoner of Operation Plunder, the massive, slow, bureaucratic plan to cross the river weeks from now. But this This changed everything. This was the fleeting opportunity that strategists dream of. He called Supreme Headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his office in Reims, took the call. When he heard the news, his famous grin spread from ear to ear. "Brad," he said, his voice electric, "that's wonderful. It's worth its weight in gold." He gave the order that would shatter the German defense of the Rhine. "Shove everything you can across. Forget the plans. Forget the boundaries, just go. We've got a bridgehead and we're going to keep it." But 400 miles to the east, in a concrete bunker deep beneath Berlin, the reaction was not joy. It was apoplectic rage. When Adolf Hitler was told that an American infantry platoon had captured the Ludendorff Bridge, he flew into one of the most violent, window-rattling tantrums of the war. He screamed that it was sabotage, treason, and cowardice. He turned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and shrieked, "This is the final betrayal! This is what happens when you fail! Find the traitors!" The German high command was thrown into a panic. The impenetrable Rhine, the sacred barrier, had been breached by a single audacious platoon. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the brilliant defender of the West, was immediately ordered to rectify the situation. Hitler's order was simple: annihilate the bridge, obliterate the bridgehead, throw the Americans back into the Rhine, and most importantly, execute every officer responsible. The German system now turned on itself in a cannibalistic fury. Hitler dispatched one of his most feared officers, the brutal Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner, to the front. He was not to command the battle. He was to command a flying court-martial. The German officers who had failed, Captain Wilhelm Bratke, the bridge commander, and Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had struggled with faulty explosives, were rounded up. Major Hans Scheller, the officer who had arrived just 2 hours before the attack, was arrested. The court-martial was a farce, a 20-minute show trial. Hübner, acting as prosecutor, judge, and jury, found them all guilty of dereliction of duty. Bragg, who had heroically stayed at his post, was sentenced to death. Scheller and 2 other officers were taken into a nearby woods, placed against a tree, and summarily executed by a firing squad. The German army, in its final throes, was now killing its own men for a failure that was not theirs. While the system was eating itself, Kesselring threw every weapon he had left at the tiny American bridgehead. For the next 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge became the most terrifying and most important piece of real estate on Earth. The suicidal charge was over. The suicidal defense had begun. The Germans hammered the bridge with over 300 artillery pieces, including a monstrous 240mm railway gun. But the Americans had an answer. The 9th Armored's artillery, joined by the entire 3-Corps artillery, began a massive counter-battery fire, engaging in a 10-day duel that shook the valley. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. Stuka's Focke-Wulf 190s, and for the first time in history in a ground attack role, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The GIs on the bridge, who had never even seen a jet, were suddenly being strafed at 550 miles per hour. But the Americans had created one of the most formidable anti-aircraft screens of the war. Hundreds of 50 caliber and 40mm Bofors guns lined the hills on both sides, creating a flak alley that was impenetrable. They shot down 31 German aircraft, including several of the irreplaceable jets. When the jets and artillery failed, the Germans turned to their wonder weapons. On March 17th, the SS fired 11 V-2 rockets at the bridge. It was the first and only time the ballistic missile was used against a tactical battlefield target. The 2,000-pound warheads, falling at supersonic speeds, were terrifying. They slammed into the town of Remagen, killing dozens of GIs and civilians, but their accuracy was abysmal. Not a single rocket hit the bridge. Finally, in a last desperate gamble, Hitler turned to his top commando, Otto Skorzeny. He ordered a team of 7 elite SS frogmen, or combat swimmers, to float down the Rhine at night, wearing Italian-made scuba gear, and plant new, powerful explosives on the bridge piers. It was a true suicidal mission. They entered the freezing 40-degree water 10 miles upstream, but the Americans were waiting. Searchlights scanned the black water. The frogmen were spotted. Machine guns opened up, turning the river's surface into a white froth. 3 were killed, 3 captured, and 1 vanished. The last German attempt had failed. All the while, the bridge held, and across it the American army poured. The 27th Armored Infantry Battalion was first, then the rest of the 9th Armored Division, then the 9th Infantry Division, then the 78th Infantry Division. They came on foot, in jeeps, in trucks, and in tanks 24 hours a day, a non-stop river of steel and olive drab flowing east. While the battle for the bridge raged above it, the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion performed their own suicidal mission on it. They worked around the clock under artillery fire, laying new planks over the 30-foot hole, reinforcing the sagging girders, and patching the structure. They were the true heroes of the 10-day battle, keeping the bridge alive by sheer force of will. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave up. It had been hit by bombs, shells, and rockets. It had been weakened by the original German demolition, and it had borne the weight of 5 divisions. At 3:00 p.m., with a terrible groaning screech of tortured metal, the bridge collapsed into the Rhine. 28 American engineers, who had been working on it, went down with it, the last men to die at Remagen. But it didn't matter. By that point, the 125,000 men and 15,000 vehicles of the bridgehead were already on the east bank. And right next to the ruined bridge, the engineers had already built 2 new heavy-duty pontoon bridges. The bridgehead was permanent. The war was lost. The impossible problem of the Rhine had been solved. Operation Plunder, 70 miles to the north, went ahead a week later. It was still a massive fight, but the German defense was a hollow shell. Their best units, like the 11th Panzer, had been frantically diverted south to try and contain the Remagen disaster. The river of blood was never the slaughter it was supposed to be, because a handful of men on a fool's errand had kicked the door down 70 miles south. After the war, the humble heroes returned to their quiet lives. General William Hoge was not court-martialed. He was celebrated as a hero, his engineer's hunch vindicated. Sergeant Alex Drabick, the first man across, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and quietly returned to his job as a butcher in Ohio. Lieutenant Emmett Burrows and Sergeants Joseph and Mike Delisio were all awarded the DSC for their suicidal charge to cut the wires, the act that had truly saved the bridge. And Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the German-born officer who led the charge, became a national hero. He was the last man to be awarded the DSC by General George S. Patton himself. He, too, refused the spotlight, becoming a salesman in Nebraska. He died tragically young, from cancer in 1951 at the age of 33. The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt, but its 2 massive stone towers, pockmarked and scarred by the shells of that 10-day battle, still stand today. They are a museum, a quiet, haunting monument. They are a testament to the fact that sometimes, in the fog of war, the greatest victories are won not by 10,000 plane bombardments or 5,000 gun barrages. They are won by one general who disobeys an order, by one lieutenant who leads a charge, and by one platoon that, in 15 terrifying minutes, runs straight into an ambush and, through sheer impossible courage, turns it into the victory that ends a war.